We shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister spent the first 18 months distracted by touring the world and spending $450 million on the divisive voice referendum, instead of focusing on making economic decisions and putting budgets together to help Australian families, not hurt them. Will the Prime Minister take responsibility for the cost of living pain that Australian families are feeling today?
Order. The Minister for Home Affairs will cease interjecting. The member for Moreton is warned. Order. Prime Minister has the call.
I'll leave people to draw their own conclusion between the gap that was there of mere seconds of speaking about the importance of our relationship with our neighbours and with the world, and that question. And that question.
Order.
And that question.
Right.
He speaks about. He asked me about what we are doing. What we are doing is dealing with cost of living pressures. Cost of living pressures that he has voted against every single one of them. The energy price relief. What did he do? He voted against it. Whether it be the tax cuts for every Australian that will come in on Monday, all 13.6 million taxpayers. He not only said that it should be rolled back from the opposition, and they said they'd reverse it. He said we should go to an election on it. That was how strongly he felt about it before he voted for it. Before he voted for it.
The Leader
he voted
of the
against
Nationals
cheaper
will cease
medicines.
interjecting.
Yeah, 60-day dispensing was going to have a devastating impact. Pharmacies were going to close. None of that happened either. He's against fee-free TAFE, where now over 400,000 Australians have already enrolled in fee-free TAFE and made a difference there. And of course we know that he has opposed wages keeping up with the cost of living. What they did...
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister was asked a very broad question regarding a whole range of topics, and he is addressing the topics in the question, so I'll hear the member for Moncrieff on a point of order.
Members should be called by the correct titles, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister has repeatedly called the opposition leader he. Members should be addressed by their correct title.
Order. A member of the Moncrieff is entitled to raise her point of order. She's assisting the House. But we'll just make sure the Prime Minister is addressing people through their correct titles, and he'll address his remarks through the chair.
Anything's possible, Mr Speaker. I wasn't aware he was a they. Anything's possible on that side, Mr Speaker. Anything is possible. But we know, of course, from Karen Middleton that not only did they have 22 different energy policies in 10 years, now we know they had 3 different energy policies in one weekend. In one weekend.
Order. The Minister for Skills will cease.
This is how their climate change denial runs. One mistake in one interview and they walk away from a 2030 target. Incredible. One slip of the tongue and they just junk it all. Just junk it all. They're basing their energy policy.
Order. The member for Lyons will cease interjecting. The Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme will cease interjecting, so I can hear from the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, the Prime Minister's had a fair run, but on relevance, Australian households can't afford to pay their mortgages. Small businesses are going broke, and this Prime Minister doesn't have a clue.
To remind the Leader of the Opposition, who's falling into a little bit of a habit of adding extra things during his points of order. He'll be always granted a point of order on relevance. The Prime Minister makes to make sure his answer is being directly relevant to the question that he was asked, and he has the call.
Yes, Mr Speaker. They've come up with the most expensive form of new energy possible. They're basing their energy policy for the next decade on the basis of a mistake in the Weekend Australian. Mr Speaker, the Shadow Cabinet got rolled by Dennis Shanahan. It's just extraordinary.
Well
done, Dennis. Keep going.
Has concluded. The House comes to order. We'll hear from the member for Reid.
My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government helping ease cost of living pressures for Australians? What measures will come into effect in July? What approaches has the government rejected?
With the court order, members on my left, the member for Barker will cease interjecting. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, I'm sure, was just talking to her colleague next door. And I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Save him, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Reid for her question. Taking action on the cost of living is, of course, our #1 priority. And a whole lot of these measures come in next Monday. Making sure that Australians can earn more and keep more of what they earn. Importantly, a pay rise for 2.6 million workers on awards. Not the first pay rise under this government in order to address cost of living pressures, but not the second, the third in just over 2 years that we've been in office. In addition to that, a tax cut for every single taxpayer, making sure that Australians can earn more and keep more.
Member for Deakin will cease interjecting.
And keep more of what they earn, Mr Speaker. We are also, of course, freezing the costs of PBS medicines, and from July 1, the $300 assistance for power bills and $325 for small business will kick in as well as the additional 2 weeks of government-funded paid parental leave. And this week we announced new rules to make sure families are getting better prices at the supermarket. We are making sure that families and farmers get a fair go. Something that those opposite never did. In a decade, Mr Speaker, in a decade. But every step of the way, those opposite have said no. No to getting wages moving, no to cheaper medicines, no to power bill relief, no to cheaper childcare, no to tax cuts for every taxpayer.
The Treasurer and the The Treasurer and the Leader of the Nationals continually to have a conversation. I can't hear a word that is happening because of the two of you. So you're going to cease for the remainder of this answer so I can hear the Prime Minister. He has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. No to affordable housing, no to fee-free TAFE, no to a future made in Australia. And now, thanks to the plan for, not quite a plan, but the suggestion of nuclear reactors, the Leader of the Opposition's addiction to saying no has taken a fresh turn, Mr Speaker. No price tag, no design, no viable sites, no legislation, no to renewables, nowhere to put the waste, no chance of pushing Australians' power bills anything other than up. It's time for Australians to return the favour and say no to this relentless negativity of this opposition leader who has nothing positive to offer.
The order. The Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. I want to hear from the member for Hume.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Core inflation in Australia is high and it is rising. It is higher than the UK, Canada, New Zealand, the Euro area, the US, Switzerland, Sweden and Norway, and in stark contrast to Australia, in all of these economies, core inflation is actually falling. Isn't this another example of this Prime Minister's weak leadership letting Australians down?
Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Treasurer will cease interjecting as well. The member for O'Connor, I just said everyone to cease interjecting. You're warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Well, some of the premise of that question, once again, are consistent with the Shadow Treasurer. The Shadow Treasurer are simply wrong. And the fact is that we inherited an inflation rate with a 6 in front of it, and the measures.
The member for Deakin has now been interjecting 10 times, so I'm just going to give him one last chance. Trying to fix behaviour here. So the member for Deakin won't be interjecting any more during this answer or any other answers, or he'll be warned. Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The fact is that inflation is lower than what we inherited. The fact is that the measures that we have put in place that have put downward pressure on inflation, such as energy price relief, have had a substantial impact on helping to drive down that inflation. And when Michelle Bullock, the RBA governor, was asked about how is Australia's experience in regards to core inflation since the beginning of this year, different or the same to that which has been observed in the US or Canada or the European area, this is what the RBA governor had to say. She said this is a very similar experience. She went on to say, if you look at core inflation and services inflation, in particular overseas, the experience there is very similar to here. She went on to say this.
Order. The member for Hume has asked his question. Do not interject for the remainder of this answer, otherwise you'll be warned and you won't be here to hear any more questions. Just going to take the temperature down, and everyone is going to listen to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. She went on to say this, something that would be unfamiliar to those opposite. Fiscal policy has been running a surplus for the past couple of years, something completely foreign to those opposite. She didn't say that the government had produced mugs. She said fiscal policy has been running a surplus for the past couple of years, so I would say that's been helping the inflation situation. That is what she very clearly said, unlike the approach of those opposite.
Give the call to the honourable member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, millions of people around the world, particularly in Australia, are thrilled by the news that Julian Assange has finally been set free and is on his way back home to Australia. Prime Minister, will you join with me in welcoming the end of this long-running saga and Mr Assange's return home to his family?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Clark for his question, and I thank him, along with the parliamentary group co-chaired by the member for Fremantle, for their commitment to this issue that I recognised has involved some members of all political parties in this place, including members of the Liberal Party and the National Party. Julian Assange is on his way home to Australia. A short time ago, a United States court in Saipan accepted a plea agreement between Mr Assange and the United States Department of Justice. Mr Assange has since boarded a flight to Australia and will land in Australia later today. Now, regardless of your views about his activities, and they will be varied, Mr Assange's case has dragged on for too long. I've said repeatedly that there was nothing to be gained by his continued incarceration, and I am pleased that he is on his way home to Australia to reunite with his family here. Over the 2 years since we took office, my government has engaged and advocated, including at leader level, to resolve this. We have used all appropriate channels. This outcome has been the product of careful, patient and determined work. work I am very proud of. The Australian government continues to provide consular assistance to Mr Assange as he returns home, as we do to Australians, for Australians right around the world. I can confirm that US Ambassador Kevin Rudd and UK High Commissioner Stephen Smith are travelling to Australia with Mr Assange. I thank them for their work and others at the respective Embassy and High Commission for helping us reach this conclusion. This work has been complex and it has been considered. This is what standing up for Australians around the world looks like. It means getting the job done, getting results and getting outcomes, having the determination to stay the course, and I'm very pleased that on this occasion this has been a successful outcome that I believe overwhelmingly Australians did want to see. As I said, they will have different views about the engagement and the activities of Mr Assange, but they will be pleased that this saga has been brought to an end and that he will be able to reunite with his family.
Before I call the member for Ryan, I'll just do a quick acknowledgement. And I've been advised of the members for Bruce, Dunkley and Chisholm. We have a delegation of representatives from local councils from Greater South East of Melbourne, including Councillor Lana Formoso, Councillor Nikki Liu, Councillor Simon Brooks, Councillor Jenna Davey-Burns, Councillor Jack Horozek, Councillor Nathan Conroy and Councillor Jude Dwight. Welcome to you all. I'm going to give the call to the honourable member for Ryan.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, yesterday your government approved a $1 billion Gina Rinehart-backed koala habitat-destroying gas project with over 150 new gas wells able to run till 2080. Prime Minister, in the middle of a climate crisis, why back billionaires to open more coal and gas, and will the Prime Minister reverse this decision? Thank you.
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ryan for her question. And as we said yesterday and as we've been saying all along, our government's priority is to get more renewables approved and more renewables into our energy system. The project that was approved yesterday is a largely domestic gas project that will support the manufacture of glass, bricks, cement, food packaging, and as for the misinformation about koala habitat, the member for Ryan is absolutely wrong. In fact, one of the conditions of approval for this project is that koala breeding and foraging habitat must be protected. Now, I think it's very important to say to the member for Ryan and to others that share her concerns, this project, like any large project in Australia, will be measured against the safeguard mechanism. The safeguard laws, the strong climate protection laws that the Greens and most of the crossbench voted for, is how we keep emissions down in Australia, how we actually get to net zero in this country. We can't get to net zero overnight, but we are making extremely strong progress. And I've spoken in this place yesterday about the number of renewable energy projects that we have already approved, 54 renewable energy projects, one every 2 weeks. And on top of these the previous Environment Minister's interjecting about koala habitat, that's pretty rich coming from a government that hid the State of the Environment report because it said that the environment in Australia was bad and getting worse under the leadership of those opposite. Nobody has done less to help the Australian environment than the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. But on this proposal and others like it, we will assess every project project by project for its environmental impacts, and of course they will also be assessed against the safeguard mechanism, voted for by those on the crossbench, said by the Greens political party climate and environment spokesperson, I think her quote on this was, under these laws, pollution will now go down, not up.
Give the call to the honourable member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How will the Albanese Labor government's Reliable Renewables Plan deliver the clean, cheap and resilient energy system that Australians deserve? What policies has the government rejected and why?
Call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the question. And renewable energy, connected by transmission and distribution, firm with storage and backed up by gas power generation, is the lowest cost way to supply electricity to homes and businesses as Australia transitions to a net zero economy, Mr Speaker. That's a direct quote from the Integrated Systems Plan released today by AEMO, our market regulator, which I'll table, Mr Speaker, a detailed, concrete, well-considered plan, Mr Speaker, which has been informed by more than 2,000 consultations and 1,000 scenarios, and finds that renewables backed by transmission and storage is the lowest cost pathway for the Australian energy system, Mr Speaker. And it goes on to say the transition is essential for the Australian economy to enjoy affordable and reliable energy while achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And, Mr Speaker, the AI Group, the Australian Industry Group, has said, and I quote, the 2024 Integrated System Plan is the best roadmap we have to meet our energy needs. And the AI Group is right, Mr Speaker. This is what good policy looks like. Well-considered policy based on facts, based on evidence, based on detail and based on research. And the member asked me what policies we reject. Well, it's not really a fair fight, Mr Speaker, when you compare the detailed documentation and the consultation which goes into the government's energy policy with the one-page thought bubble we see from those opposite, Mr Speaker. No costings, no details, no models, no details whatsoever. And we know the opposition knows the costs. The Leader of the National Party let the cat out of the bag, so we know what they are. We're just not ready to tell you yet. It's a surprise. It's a surprise, according to those opposite. We know nuclear power is very expensive, but we also know this, and again, as is usually the case, there's some members opposite who say the quiet bit out loud. They tend to be from the National Party and Queensland, Mr Speaker, and I give credit to the honesty from the Queensland National Party. It's not just that nuclear is expensive to build. It's also that to make it work, it needs to force out the cheapest form of energy, renewables, Mr Speaker. The member for Hinkler admitted this, and he said, the member for Hinkler said, clearly, if you have energy generation that works 100% of the time, you would always use that before intermittent wind and solar. And Senator Canavan said, what we really need is a greater priority given to electricity that can be provided all the time. So when they release their modelling, will they be releasing how much they'll curtail rooftop solar? How much they'll be telling Australians not to use their rooftop solar, Mr Speaker? How much they'll be saying that they don't want renewables? The Leader of the National Party again said he's going to cap large-scale renewables. That's the real intent of this anti-renewable policy, Mr Speaker. They want to shut down renewable energy investment in this country because of their ideological prejudice against it, because they don't like cheap renewable energy and they don't have a real plan for Australia. What they are is a real risk for Australia.
Has concluded. The call to the honourable member for Hume.
My question is to the Prime Minister. After 2 years of Labor's homegrown inflation, food is up by over 11%, rents are up by 14%, electricity is up by over 21% and gas is up by over 22%. Isn't this another example of this Prime Minister's weak leadership letting Australians down?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Hume for his question. Now, as the Prime Minister indicated in his answer a moment ago, you have to be very careful about the facts that the Shadow Treasurer puts in his questions. And this gives me, and the reason why I'm so grateful to the Prime Minister for letting me answer this question, because it gives me an opportunity to correct some of the facts that the Shadow Treasurer has been peddling in the last half an hour or so. Now, the first one, if he wants to talk about homegrown inflation, then homegrown inflation is non-tradables, Mr Speaker, and non-tradable inflation is lower under us than it was under them. And the same is true, Mr Speaker, of headline inflation. Inflation, when we came to office, as the Prime Minister rightly said, was 6.1%. Now it is 4% in the monthly indicator, and that's too high. We're upfront about that. That is too high, but it is much lower than the inflation that we inherited from those opposite Mr Speaker. And this answer also gives me the opportunity to point out to the Shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker, that he has now said twice today something which is factually wrong about international comparisons of inflation. And I thought that I would take this opportunity to correct the Shadow Treasurer for making this mistake twice in the last half an hour or so. Now, he said a moment ago in the question to the Prime Minister that core inflation in Canada was going down. Core inflation in Canada is going up. And while we're at it, Mr Speaker, we should tell the Shadow Treasurer that core inflation in the euro area is also going up. And so that's a reminder, Mr Speaker, and again the Prime Minister hit the nail on the head a moment ago in his answer, and the Governor of the Reserve Bank similarly in the quote that the Prime Minister shared, when the Governor and the Prime Minister have pointed out that it's not unusual around the world in countries where inflation peaked higher and earlier than it did here in Australia. It's not unusual, particularly with these more volatile monthly figures, for the number to bounce around and zigzag on the way down. We saw in the US earlier in the year, Mr Speaker, that inflation went up twice before it started to come down again. And as the Governor of the Reserve Bank and the Prime Minister have rightly pointed out, our experience in Australia is not materially different from the kind of experience that we are seeing around the world. So, Mr Speaker, if the Shadow Treasurer is unhappy with inflation at 4%, as are we, Mr Speaker, he must have been absolutely filthy at the 6.1% that he presided over. He must have been absolutely furious at the performance of his own government when they bequeathed us inflation at 6.1%. Now, as I said, Mr Speaker, inflation in the monthly indicator today, it edged down in monthly terms, but at 4% annual, it is still too high. We want inflation to be lower and sooner, and that's why our cost of living relief, which kicks in on Monday, is so important.
The member for Deakin interjected 7 times during that answer. He is now warned. I'd like to hear from the member for Cornwall.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What do the latest figures tell us about the fight against inflation and how the Albanese Labor government's economic plan compared to other approaches?
No, I wrote it actually.
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I acknowledge the wonderful service of the member for Cornwall over a long period of time in this place and thank her for the question as well. Mr Speaker, as I said a moment ago, we got new inflation data today which showed that inflation edged down in monthly terms, but at 4% annual it is still too high. Mr Speaker, we acknowledge that. Of course, we need inflation to be lower and sooner. I think that's an objective that we all share. But while we acknowledge that inflation is still too high in our economy, we also need to acknowledge and remember some important facts which have been lost on those opposite. As I said before, as we've said many times, the monthly numbers bounce around. They don't compare the same goods and services. As I said a moment ago, the experience in other countries is that inflation doesn't always moderate in a straight line, and the last mile is the hardest, and that's why we've seen core inflation go up in Canada and in the euro area as well, Mr Speaker. Inflation at 4.0% is too high, but it is much lower than the 6.1% that we inherited from those opposite, and it is less than half of its peak a couple of years ago, Mr Speaker. Now, the other important thing that shouldn't be lost on this House is that inflation would be much higher if we were running our budgets and our economy in the irresponsible and wasteful way that those opposite were carrying on in government. Now, when inflation was higher and rising, they handed down a budget with $40 billion of new spending and no savings. And by their own test, Mr Speaker, if budgets are such a key determinant of prices in our economy, then they failed their own test when they were in government, Mr Speaker. Now, inflation would be higher still were it not for the cost of living policies that they voted against. In the ABS data today, we find out that electricity was up 6.5%, but it would have been 14.5% without our energy bill relief. Rents were up 7.4%, but they would have gone up 9.3% without our rent assistance, Mr Speaker. That's why our cost of living help is so important. It's why it's so warranted, it's why it's so necessary, and it's why it's so timely. On Monday, people will start to get a tax cut, an energy bill relief, a pay rise for people on awards, cheaper medicines and more weeks of PPL, Mr Speaker. Now, this is how you deliver cost of living relief, not by pushing up energy prices with nuclear reactors, Mr Speaker. So, Mr Speaker, today's inflation figures were another reminder of the pressures that people are under that we acknowledge and that we are responding to, and another important reminder of just how crucial it is that we help people with the cost of living and that we do that in 5 days' time in all the ways that we've talked about. At the same time as we turn big Liberal deficits into Labor surpluses in a way that the Governor of the Reserve Bank says is helping in the fight against inflation.
Give a call to the Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this economically illiterate Prime Minister, families and small businesses are hurting.
I just want to hear from the Leader of the House, but I do want to deal with this following on from a couple of weeks ago. Yep.
Mr Speaker, you made a ruling in response to the Manager of Opposition Business a few weeks ago. That ruling was made at the request of the opposition. You also indicated that if we had questions like this, we'd start looking at just simply going to the next question.
On the 30th of May at 2:19 p.m, the Manager of Opposition Business asked me to direct the Treasurer to cease his repeated practice of undignified personal attacks. That was raised by the Manager, and I agreed with him at the time that personal reflection on the members shall be considered highly disorderly. So, in light of that, we're going to continue with the practice from the 30th of May to ensure that those sorts of remarks aren't made. Out of respect for the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, I will ask her to begin her question again without that remark and make sure that she's complying with practice and standing orders.
Thank
the
you,
Deputy Leader of the
Speaker.
Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this Prime Minister, families and small businesses are hurting, with core inflation having now increased for 4 consecutive months to 4.4%. As the Reserve Bank Governor said last week, groceries, petrol, health, education, rent, insurance expenses, they're all going up. Isn't this another example of this Prime Minister's weak leadership letting Australians down?
The question is in order. Order. The Minister for Resources will cease interjecting. And the Prime Minister has the call and is now going to be heard in silence.
Mr Speaker, that question and the reframing of it says more about the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and her character than anything else. Mr Speaker. Just like Mr Speaker, we saw on the weekend her leader of the opposition go from a so-called policy announcement that we know now was actually a mistake that led to them change their position into a full-scale personal attack.
The member for order. Okay. We don't need. We're going to do this in an orderly manner. We don't need comments continually at the chair. The House comes to order. We'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, it was a very tight question about inflation and the Prime Minister's leadership. And the Prime Minister does not have licence to engage in a wide-ranging trawl over other matters. He should be directed back to the question.
Yeah, the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I refer you to the multiple rulings by Speaker Smith, where he made clear that if he was letting a question through that was borderline in any way, that the rules of relevance were wide open, and that ruling was made repeatedly by Tony Smith when he was in the Speaker's chair. This question is exactly in line with all of those precedents.
I have a series of precedents and decisions by former speakers here. The issue I have with this question, it wasn't a tight question. It was a very broad question revolving around a whole range of issues regarding the Prime Minister's leadership. If you're going to ask a broad question about someone's leadership and their decisions that they make, and you frame in with a range of topics, of course the Prime Minister is going to be pretty broad in their answer. This is not a question that we've had before about a fact or a figure or a yes or a no. It was a broad statement raising a number of issues. So if we're going to have these types of questions, just as have happened in previous parliaments, including the immediate parliament before this one, where I was a member, you're going to have a very broad answer. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm asked a question about leadership, and I'm happy to answer a question about leadership, because we know that for the Leader of the Opposition, any endorsement is a kiss of death. In the pre-selection for the Queensland LNP Senate ticket, he endorsed sitting Senator Gerard Rennick.
That's what proves the point.
Order. Order. The Minister for Industry will cease objecting.
He wrote a written letter of support asking people to support Gerard as part of my team. Now, Rennick's now suing the LNP and Peter Dutton, claiming the party is run in an unprofessional manner. He did better, Mr Speaker. In a three-man race to replace Maurice Payne, he backed two of the three horses. They were Zed Seselja and Andrew Constance, not one but two. He put written endorsements in for Zed. I have no doubt that if he is re-elected to Parliament, Zed will again play a senior role within the coalition. For Andrew Constance, he said, having been a senior cabinet minister, Andrew has a wealth of policy-making experience. Well, guess what? He backed two horses in a three-horse race, and the third horse won. The third horse won, Mr Speaker, with Dave Sharma. And, of course, then he endorsed Holly Hughes. But the Shadow Treasurer had something else in mind, Mr Speaker. The Shadow Treasurer out there helping to knock off one of his own cabinet.
The order. The member for Hume, the member for Deakin will cease interjecting. The member for Barker will cease interjecting. Well, the member for Hume, if you keep going, I'm not going to hear from the Leader of the Opposition. Okay? The Leader of the Opposition, a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, it's on relevance. Australians really are hurting under this government at the moment, and we're talking about...
We've had a point of order on relevance already. Yeah. The members, both of you can resume your seat. Member for Hume. Member for Hume, just before the Prime Minister takes it, just leave the opposition. Everyone take their seat. That'll help. So one point of order under the standing orders is able to be taken under relevance. Because of the Leader's opposition position, he's always given the call for a point of order. So that point of order has been taken. We've got 23 seconds to go. I'm just going to ask the Prime Minister to return to the question so we can move forward through the rest of question time.
Talking about leadership, Holly Hughes, Oblivion, Anne Ruston knocked off the top of the ticket by Alex Antich, even though she's a senior shadow minister. And of course there's the member for Moore up there, who also got his endorsement and lost a ballot 137 to 39.
Prime Minister, resume his seat. Order. Members on my left will now cease interjecting. Now the House has come to order. We'll hear from the member for Jagga Jagga.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Why is it important to have an energy plan for this critical decade? How does this compare with other approaches? And why is it important to be upfront and honest with the Australian people?
Call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, I appreciate very much the question from the honourable member for Jagajaga, Mr Speaker. And of course, the honourable member asked about our energy plan, and today we've seen AEMO release the Integrated Systems Plan, which is a concrete, detailed, modelled analysis of what our energy system needs and what our government will deliver. And of course, in 5 days' time, we also deliver $300 in energy bill relief to every Australian with an energy bill, Mr Speaker. And of course, all this is critical. And what else is critical? For investment in Australia, for investment in jobs, for investment in our energy system, is being part of the international framework of climate and energy. And of course, an important part of that is being part of the Paris Accord. And what we've seen a particularly stark comparison in approaches here over the last couple of weeks. The Leader of the Opposition 2 Saturdays ago told the Australian newspaper he'd rip up the 43% target. And of course, Mr Speaker, that would put us in breach of the Paris Accord and put us in the company of Iran and Yemen and Libya, Mr Speaker. Great investment destinations, Iran, Libya and Yemen. But we now know, reading in The Guardian, that this was accidental. It takes some doing to accidentally breach an international treaty, but I hand it to the Leader of the Opposition. There was a flurry of phone calls, we now know. Maybe the Leader of the Opposition rang the member for Fairfax and said, "Honey, I shrank the Paris Accord," Mr Speaker. As they dealt with the accident that he created. But this is what we get when we get energy policy on the run and details made up by the Leader of the Opposition. It was just a year ago. He said, and I quote, the Leader of the Opposition said, and I quote, "I don't support the establishment of big nuclear facilities here at all. I'm opposed to it." Well, I'd hate to see what he would do if he was for it, Mr Speaker, because he's announced 5 of them a couple of weeks ago. And when it comes to detail, just in the last 2 weeks, on 5 separate public occasions, in 5 separate interviews, the Leader of the Opposition has said, when asked about waste from nuclear facilities, he said, well, with a small modular reactor, you get 1 can of Coke a year worth of waste, Mr Speaker. 1 can of Coke. Now, I heard it the first time, I thought, oh, everybody can make a mistake. You know, everybody can misspeak once. We won't make an issue out of that. 5 times he said it, Mr Speaker. And what is the real figure based on analysis from Rolls-Royce, the company of the Leader of the Opposition has approvingly quoted? It's 12,500 cans of Coke a year from a small modular reactor, Mr Speaker. You're just 12,499 out, Mr Speaker. So this is what we get when we get a Leader of the Opposition who's not across the detail of this important policy area, who's making it up as he goes along, and is letting the member for New England and Senator Canavan and the member for Hinkler and the Leader of the Nationals write their energy policy. When you let the Nationals do their energy policy in Australia, Mr Speaker, what—
The Minister will pause. The member for Deakin will leave the chamber on 94A. The Minister will refer to members by their titles. There is far too much noise. It's going to stop right now. And the Minister has 22 seconds remaining.
When you let the National Party near energy policy, Mr Speaker, what you get is an anti-renewables policy for this country. You get the most expensive form of energy. You put Australia in the company of Libya, Yemen and Iran, but apparently it all happens by accident.
Give the call. I understand it is a question for the crossbench. Yep. Order. Yep, the member for Kooyong has the call.
Oh, okay.
It is the opposition.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
The member for Kooyong has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. I have a question for the Minister for Health. Minister, the approval and funding of new drugs and novel medical technologies in this country is too slow. Australians deserve best practice health care, but every week I hear from constituents in my electorate of Kooyong who are struggling to access emerging therapies for serious conditions. Today, on Rare Cancers Awareness Day, what assurance can we offer our constituents that the government is going to improve these processes?
Give the call to the Minister for Health.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Kooyong for her question, not only as a member of parliament representing her community, but also, before she entered this place, an esteemed researcher and clinician down in Melbourne who understands our healthcare system better than most. As she knows, as everyone in this place knows, we have a terrific medicine system in this country, really built on the foundation of the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, which gives Australian patients access to cutting-edge, world's best technology, importantly at affordable prices. As you know, Mr Speaker, and everyone here knows, some of the technologies today literally cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient, but if listed on the PBS will come down to just $31 a script. And the PBS is constantly growing. We've added more than 200 new or expanded listings in just 2 years. The member is right. Our health technology assessment systems are old and they are struggling with the pace of technology, just this turbocharged period of discovery that we are lucky enough to be living through right now, Mr Speaker. This was partly explored through a House of Reps inquiry last term that was chaired by the former member for North Sydney, Trent Zimmerman, deputy chaired by the member for Macarthur, but it's been explored even more deeply by a Health Technology Assessments Review, the first independent review of our systems in about 30 years. We know this technology is coming at us at a furious pace. There are, for example, I'm told around 7 cell and gene therapies registered with the TGA now in Australia. There are almost 4,000 in development heading our way. And the development of AI is only going to accelerate that process of drug discovery and trials through molecular simulation. I'm told already the first end-to-end AI-designed drug is in a phase 2 clinical trial somewhere around the world, and that is just going to accelerate as well, Mr Speaker. So this review is timely. It is exploring these issues to make sure that our HTA systems, our technology assessment systems, are not just fit for today, because we know these technologies are more complex, they're coming at us very quickly, they don't fit neatly into the old categories of a medicine or a diagnostic or a service. They're often quite hybrid technologies, and we do need to build an HTA system that lasts for the next 30 years. The next 30 years are going to make the last 30, as extraordinary as they have been, seem pretty pedestrian by comparison, I think we all suspect. That review has been delivered. It actually landed on my desk this morning. We're going to give it due consideration. It was subject to very deep and broad consultation. It's an important piece of work started by the former government, continued by us, and I look forward to an ongoing discussion in this place and more broadly around the country about how we do exactly what the member for Kooyong's question asked.
Go back to the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When the Prime Minister condemned the violent River to the Sea chant, Labor Senator Fatima Payman publicly rebuked him and repeated it. Yesterday, Senator Payman crossed the floor to support the Greens' hate-filled campaign to foment social divisions on Palestine, apparently without consequences. Prime Minister Bob Hawke, when he was leader of the Labor Party, suspended 2 members for such actions. Every leader since him has stood up and shown strength of leadership. Will the Prime Minister do the same?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. I note the regular tracks of members of the LNP to sit on the same side as the government at various times, and something that they say is a positive.
Order. The Minister for Home Affairs will cease interjecting. The member for Barker is warned. The Prime Minister is going to be heard in silence.
I make this point, Mr Speaker. From the river to the sea refers to the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. The problem with from the river to the sea being one state, whether just Israel or just Palestine, is that it denies the existence of the other peoples and denies the need for a two-state solution, which is why I have consistently opposed it. I have consistently supported 2 states, Palestine and Israel, living side by side in peace and security, and that is the Australian Labor Party's position, and I'm proud of it. I have consistently opposed the actions, of course, from day one of what occurred with the terrorist act on October 7, which Hamas committed atrocities and need to be totally condemned. I have also expressed my grave concern at the humanitarian loss in Gaza, including our call for the ground invasion of Rafah to not occur because we warned of what the consequences of that would be. I regret the loss of all innocent life, whether it be Israeli or Palestinian. That is the principal position that I have taken, and that is why I have yesterday, in the position that was put forward by Senator Wong in the Senate, was a principled one. The need for the Senate to recognise the state of Palestine as a part of a peace process in support of a two-state solution and a just and enduring peace. It's beyond me why the Greens political party or the Liberal Party or the National Party did not support that position. But the truth is that they did not. The truth is that they did not. That is the appropriate position being put forward. I met with Senator Payman earlier today. She will not be attending the Labor caucus for the rest of this session.
The Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. The member for Hasluck. Order. Ministers will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister is addressing the question directly. The Prime Minister is directly answering the question. He is mentioning the person you mentioned in your question. It is impossible to take a question on relevance. Resume your seat. Yes, and under the standing orders, that is not because I will refer to earlier decisions by Speaker Smith on exactly this issue regarding not taking points of order when the Speaker believes the Prime Minister or Minister is being directly relevant. Resume your seat. Resume your seat. Prime Minister has the call. Prime Minister has the call. Members on my right. Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. What I do is show leadership for our united team. What he does is fail to provide any leadership, which is why the kiss of death is endorsement from this bloc.
Good call to the honourable member for Fraser.
My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Water. What progress has the Albanese Labor government made on renewable energy approvals? What approaches has the government rejected?
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Well, thanks so much, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for Fraser. I know that he is a strong supporter of the transition to get more renewable energy into our energy grid in Australia. This energy transition is real. It's happening now. We are replacing fossil fuels with cheaper, cleaner, renewable energy because that will bring down emissions and it will bring down power prices. Of course, it's a big job, but we are working overtime to catch up on a wasted decade of energy policy under those opposite. 22 energy policies and they didn't land a single one of them. They were warned that 24 coal-fired power stations were closing. They did nothing to replace the energy generation required. They were so anti-renewables and so chaotic that they scared investment in renewables offshore. In contrast, under us, we see a renewable energy boom. In fact, we've already seen, as the Minister for Energy keeps telling us, a 25% increase in renewable energy in our grid. And as Environment Minister, I am ticking off renewable energy projects at the rate of one a fortnight. I've already ticked off 54 projects. That's enough to power more than 3 million homes. And we're ticking off renewables projects at the rate of 7 to 1 in comparison with coal and gas projects. Of course, there is an alternative. We can continue with the transition to renewable energy, or we can get distracted again by the nuclear fantasy proposed by those opposite. The Australian Energy Market Operator says, and I quote, "The time it would take to design and build nuclear generation would be too slow to replace retiring coal-fired generation." And the Smart Energy Council has told us that their plan would cost $600 billion. Now, we rely on third-party costings because although those opposite tell us they know the cost, they're not prepared to share it with the Australian public. And I'll tell you why. They're hiding it for one reason only. They know that Australian taxpayers don't want to spend $600 billion on nuclear power plants. They'd rather spend that money on hospitals or roads or schools or any of the things that need doing in Australia. Nuclear energy is expensive. It's getting more expensive. Renewables are cheaper, and they're getting cheaper all the time. There is a reason that 3 million Australian households have elected to put renewable energy, solar panels on their roofs. They know it brings down prices. That's what we're about. We're about bringing down emissions and bringing down power prices.
Call to member for Paterson.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories. How is the Albanese Labor government investing in regional Australia and easing the cost of living pressures on regional Australians, the ones that they face? What policies has the government rejected for regional Australia?
Call to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories. Okay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Paterson for that question. An amazing fighter for her local community. A community in Port Stephens that will be now receiving an extra $3 million under Roads to Recovery, bringing their 5-year funding to $6.86 million, because on this side of the House we believe in assisting every regional community for better roads, not just some. In the last 2 years, I've travelled across Australia and I've spoken to many communities about cost of living pressures, and it's why this government is taking action. In 5 days, we will see real cost of living relief provided to regional Australians, with the average taxpayer receiving $1,888. And that is how you deliver cost of living relief, not by pushing up power prices with nuclear reactors. Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we know power prices are a serious issue for regional Australians, and that's why we're working hard to create a reliable and realistic energy future. Our Reliable Renewables Plan is the only plan supported by experts to deliver clean, cheap, reliable and resilient energy that the Australians of this country deserve. Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, in only a few short days' time, we'll be taking $300 off power bills. But we see the Leader of the Opposition will take about 2 decades to serve up the most expensive form of energy that there is. CSIRO figures show us that this is the most expensive form of energy. It is up to 8 times more expensive than firmed renewables. While we're delivering energy security, they're delivering press releases, and while we're out talking to regional Australians, they're talking to themselves. Those opposite put out a plan, but it's probably better referred to as a pipe dream. They didn't even bother to call the mayors in which those 7 reactors would be hosted. They are pushing off action into the never-never. In a complete contrast, Labor is delivering a plan to put regional Australia at the heart of our future made in Australia, backed by $22.7 billion of investment in the budget to unlock economic opportunities across industries like green metals, low-carbon fuels, critical minerals and clean energy manufacturing, a plan that uses local skills and supports making more things in our own backyard and invests in our local workforce. That's how you deliver growth for regional communities, not waiting for another decade to tick by with delays and excuses for a new power source only to have to pay more for it. We are serious about delivering cost of living relief, unlike those opposite, and we're doing it by delivering tax tax cuts and energy reform now, not by pushing up power prices, by delivering nuclear reactors in decades to come.
Call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the National Seniors Social Survey paints a stark picture of life for older Australians struggling with the cost of living crisis. Many older Australians are foregoing basics like fresh fruit and milk and stockpiling petrol to make means ends. One Queensland woman wrote that she has to choose between seeing her grandchildren or affording medical treatment. Isn't this another example of Labor's homegrown inflation making life harder for our most vulnerable?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Maranoa for his question, Leader of the National Party. And indeed, we recognise that many Australians are doing it tough. And for people who are on a fixed income, particularly if they're retired and pensioners, they do it tough in Australian society. And that's why the support that you spoke about, if they're in Queensland, not just the $300 energy bill relief, but that will be on top of the relief of the Queensland government that was announced in its budget just a short time ago, will bring that support to well over $1,000 as a result. And of course, in addition to that, I have spoken to people in the great state of Queensland, and I'll say that just once today, given circumstances later this evening. I've spoken to people who have an energy bill of zero as a result of the support of state and federal governments to make an enormous difference. The second thing is, with people who are pensioners, will be far more likely to need pharmaceuticals than you or myself. And the difference that it's made in having the reduction, firstly, from January 1 last year, $42.50 down to $30, but then, in addition to that, the freeze, that will make an enormous difference. And then, on top of that, the 60-day dispensing, which literally cuts costs in half, has made an enormous difference, to our older Australians who rely upon the pharmaceuticals for various health conditions. In addition to that, of course, one of the things that the Health Minister has done regularly is to list pharmaceuticals that are in regular use. Not wait, but list at regular intervals to make a substantial difference so that they can receive that support. We understand that cost of living pressures are the #1 priority, and that's precisely why we've put in place measures as well that are designed to put that downward pressure on inflation that also makes a difference. And that's why as well I know that the Leader of the National Party wants divestment of supermarkets, but that's why we regarded that as not being an appropriate response, and Dr Emerson's report made it clear as well that we have mandating rather than a voluntary code of conduct, something that was never done by those opposite, and they sat there.
Order.
They sat there. So they offered it just after you lost government. You didn't do it for 9 years, but you offered it 2 years ago. It's only June.
Concluded. Order. The Minister for the Environment and Water will cease objecting. Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Oh, sorry. Give the question to the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Health. What action is the Albanese Labor government taking to strengthen Medicare? Why is urgent action needed after a decade of cuts and neglect?
Give the call now to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker. As the Treasurer said, Mr Speaker, we're so delighted to have the member for Gilmore back with us in the parliament. She has been a huge advocate for better health care on the South Coast. And at the last election, she argued very strongly for an urgent care clinic in her region. And already the Batemans Bay Medicare Urgent Care Clinic has seen almost 5,000 patients, every single one of them fully bulk billed for their service. In the lead-up to the election, though, she was also one of many members now on this side of the parliament who were reporting growing concern in their community about the falling rates of bulk billing for GP visits. And indeed, while the former government refused to publish the bulk billing rates for GP visits in particular, when we came to government, it became clear that bulk billing was in freefall. And the reason why was just as clear, frankly, a decade of cuts and neglect to Medicare, a deliberate program from the Liberal Party to undermine bulk billing. Because remember, Mr Speaker, the father of the modern Liberal Party, John Howard, described bulk billing as, in his words, an absolute rort. The former Health Minister, now Leader of the Opposition, tried to abolish bulk billing altogether. He said, in his words, there were too many free Medicare services, Mr Speaker. It was no wonder why doctors voted him the worst health minister in the 40-year history of Medicare. Well, that's not our approach, Mr Speaker, because for Labor, bulk billing is literally the beating heart of Medicare, and that's why we tripled the bulk billing incentive in last year's budget, the biggest investment in bulk billing in the 40-year history of Medicare. And in the member for Gilmore's electorate, that lifted the payment for a standard bulk bill GP consult by 50%, Mr Speaker, by 50%, something the College of GPs described as a game changer. And on top of all that, Mr Speaker, the government has delivered the two biggest across-the-board increases to the Medicare rebate in 30 years, since Paul Keating was the Prime Minister, the biggest and the second biggest increase in the Medicare rebate. We've increased the Medicare rebate in just 2 years by more than those opposite managed in 9 long years. And as a result of all this, in Gilmore, the bulk billing rate for GP visits in the last 7 months has gone up by almost 6%. Almost 6%. And across the nation in May, there were more than 900,000 additional free visits to the doctor. 900,000 in just 1 month, Mr Speaker. That's what you get under this government. You get more bulk billing, you get cheaper medicines, and that is how you help with the cost of living, not by pushing up power prices with risky nuclear reactors.
Give the call to the honourable member for Goldstein.
There's concern in Goldstein about the state government's suburban rail loop project. With plans for many high-rise apartments, residents fear traffic chaos and overwhelmed education and health services, with the possibility the SRL will never be completed because the Victorian government can't pay for it. It's been reported it could blow the Commonwealth infrastructure budget, especially if the federal government has to rescue a partly built project. What information has the minister received from her department, and will any information or advice received be made public?
Give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thanks very much to the member for that question. Of course, the suburban rail loop is a once-in-a-generation infrastructure project that will transform the way in which people move about the state of Victoria and also reshape the way in which Victoria grows, including where people live and the opportunities for people to live around public transport, something that this government is very supportive of. Of course, that we have made a capped contribution of $2.2 billion towards the early works of Suburban Rail Loop East, and release of that funding is contingent on the program meeting the conditions under the National Land Transport Act, as is any project that the Commonwealth invests funding in, which includes project proposal reports, which we have not received from the Victorian government yet. As I have made very clear on a number of occasions, no decisions have been made about further funding before any further requests for funding are agreed to, Victoria will need to work with Infrastructure Australia so that it can provide advice on this project. But in relation to planning issues, this is primarily a matter for the Victorian government, but we know that in order to address housing affordability, we need a steady supply of new housing, and in the right places, supported by the right infrastructure. And that does mean, as I say, building housing around really important public transport links.
The minister will pause, and the member for Wannon on a point of order.
Just on relevance, Speaker, the minister was asked about the cost and whether the Victorian state government could afford it. Yes, you were. And I would like
resume your seat. No, she wasn't asked about that. The question contained what information the minister will receive, and that is an abuse of the point of order. You simply can't get up and add something into the question. And the minister is being directly relevant. She's talking about the cost. She's talking about it's not accurate what you said. It's not accurate. The member for Lyons and the member for Wannon continuously raises points of order that are not within the standing order. The member for Goldstein on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, thank you to the member for Wannon, but the redirection to the question was what information has the minister received on relevance from her department, and will that information be made public? Thank you.
Well, the minister is being directly relevant, and the minister has completed her answer. The member for Werriwa has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. How are the Albanese Labor government's reform to bargaining helping people earn more and keep more of what they earn? How is this different from earlier predictions about these reforms?
Give a call to the Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and the Minister for the Arts.
I want to thank the member for the question and indicate there's some good news for workers in your part of Sydney for that reference in the question to people wanting to earn more and keep more of what they earn. Now, you might remember when the Secure Jobs Better Pay legislation went through. There was a change in there to establish multi-employer bargaining, and uncharacteristically, it made the Leader of the Opposition a little bit angry. Uncharacteristically, it made the Shadow Minister, Senator Cash, exaggerate a little bit. She said it would close down Australia. Those opposite in their speeches said it would result in coast-to-coast strikes. Well, the results are starting to come in on all of this. Only the other week we had the latest results on days lost to industrial action. Their last quarter, days lost to industrial action, 128,000 days. The figures just come in for the most recent quarter, days lost to industrial action, 16,000 days. The days lost to industrial action was 7 times higher under those. But at the same time that that's happened, we're getting the results come in on multi-employer bargaining. And at the risk again of making the Leader of the Opposition angry, this does involve a union. It involves the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, because we now have one of the first multi-employer bargains registered and delivering pay rises in the sector. And one of these has 200 employees across 8 companies, including some who work at Liverpool Hospital, not within the members' electorate, but very much servicing members' electorate in south-western Sydney. I spoke to one of those workers, Josh, who's been working in the industry for 12 years. As a result of this multi-employer bargain, he's now getting a $100 a week pay rise. $100 every week that those opposite tried to stop him from getting. Further pay rises locked in over the next 3 years. As well as his pay rise, he's also getting a tax cut of $3,700 a year. That's how you help people with the cost of living, not by pushing up their power prices with your risky, expensive nuclear reactors. And when I rang Josh, this is what he said to me. He said it's not just better for us. He said it's better for the operators too. He said it's better for the employers, because they can do the right thing by their workers now and not be undercut by dodgy operators. Something that is only possible because we now have multi-employer bargaining. Companies now compete on quality, on systems, on brand, whereas those opposite just wanted to be competing on a race to the bottom on wages. People can earn more, keep more of what they earn, instead of the Leader of the Opposition's plan of earning longer for less.
Call to the Prime Minister.
I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Order.